Well, good evening, everyone. Hello, cousins and bits of the family tree I see floating around. Thanks first to the National Trust for the invitation to speak tonight, initially from Anne Brake, who is running Canberra at the moment, I believe, and now she handed over to Millie Bartlett, and thanks, Millie, for taking the reins. Thanks to Julian, CEO of the National Trust, and Jason, good to see you. Lovely to be back in this is your house again, I believe, yes. And also thanks, Pat, for that very kind introduction. And I'd especially like to thank and endorse Robin Collard's Welcome to Country. The acknowledgement of Whadjuk Noongar land is very important as we reflect on O'Connor's time in West Australia, the gold-powered public works of the late 1890s and early 20th century. This was a time when engineers were changing the order of things and fitting out the state, a time when cultural awareness and environmental impact was low on the agenda. And we're standing at the moment on an ancient fishing ground of the Whadjuk Noongar people. I think we need to recognise that. And the important thing, we need to meld these stories together, the European and the Aboriginal stories, as we move towards 2026 and 2029. These stories have got to come together as part of a great reconciliation. To our family, Charles Yelverton O'Connor's achievements in the decade he spent in West Australia are a source of great pride. But over the years of listening and talking, I've realised it's a much more complex story than just grand design engineering. O'Connor arrived in 1891 with the shortest JDF ever issued by the Public Works Department. Railways, harbours, everything. It was the answer to O'Connor's query about what would you like me to do? Now, and trying to get under his skin and figure out how he achieved so much, I found it's like chasing ghosts. What were his passions, his motivations? And how did he remain so resilient and focused on his work as chief engineer against such rising criticism? And why did he lose all that hope on that hot March morning 120 years ago when he had the world at his feet? Now, there are two big projects which dominate O'Connor's life here in West Australia. We're on the trail. The facts, and I'm going to speak about those two this evening. The facts are easy to research, the furphies are easy to spot, but the family stories, due to the nature of O'Connor's death, are full of silences and have to be treated with care. O'Connor's public papers, challenging and perceptive, tell us a great deal, but sadly very few of his private papers remain. The harbour was his expressed favourite. It was the first job presented to him by Forrest, and with a great sense of urgency. With his inner harbour plan, he went against almost every opinion. And as we know in Fremantle, everyone has at least one opinion. Just look at the current debate on the new road bridge. Eventually, O'Connor convinced Forrest with his confidence of experience and meticulous planning to support his proposal. The everything in his JDF turned out to be the Goldfields water pipeline. Now, the initial idea of moving water from the coast to the Goldfields amazingly came from an anonymous letter in the West Australian in March 1894. This was picked up by Forrest and passed on to O'Connor, who declared it. Forrest dismissed the idea and handed it on, probably stuck in his back pocket, and said, "Have a look at this." And O'Connor said, "This is perfectly practical, perfectly feasible." O'Connor never claimed the idea of the pipeline himself, but the elegant engineering solution he came up with is his, and the political father of the scheme is undoubtedly John Forrest. They were a great team. I first met my grandfather in the 1950s when my mum bundles all us kids in the green Holden station wagon and headed down to Fremantle Harbour. I was underwhelmed, looking up at this figure towering above us with his head in the clouds, and what looked like a rolled newspaper under his arm. My mother said he's a famous engineer, which meant nothing to me at the time. I looked at life through a lens of sport, and I wanted to be told that the rolled-up newspaper was really a cricket bat and he'd scored a century against England before lunch at the Boxing Day test on the MCG. My mum, his granddaughter, battled on bravely, but I tuned out. In grade 5, we were told the story that O'Connor killed himself when someone turned on the water in Kalgoorlie and nothing came out. I took this as gospel. So that's our first O'Connor furphy for the evening. And I'm sure I will hear it again over the next few months while guiding school groups around Fremantle, as Jason mentioned, as part of the wonderful Fremantle Then and Now exhibition. My brother Rod, whose project on O'Connor was 7 years later, had the correct scenario. The water came through as predicted 10 months after his death. So the teachers' common room at Christchurch Grammar School had done their homework. There it is, valuable artefact, this one. I checked on Rod a couple of weeks ago. He now lives in Ethiopia, and I asked him what he remembered about the project. He's the steel trap memory repository of our family. He recalls our grandmother Bridget, CY's youngest daughter, lending him a pocketbook belonging to her father, which was very exciting for the young lad until he began reading it. It was written at an important time of O'Connor's life in 1897 when he was in Europe visiting German factories sourcing steel for the pipeline project. It was just a list of factory names and dates. No mention of tasty German sausages or sightseeing experiences. Other diaries, and there aren't many, are the same. He seemed too busy for descriptive words. Adjectives and adverbs weren't part of his makeup. Rod, hoping to break a big story with some primary research, was rather disappointed. The other disappointment was when he showed the project to Gran. She didn't think his O'Connor looked much like her father at all, but he still got 18 out of 20. So O'Connor the engineer soon faded into the background for me, and I carried on a haze of sport, teaching and travelling. My philosophy of dealing with my ancestors at that time is best explained by the English poet Sir Thomas Overbury, who said, "The man who has not anything to boast but his illustrious ancestors is like a potato. The only good belonging to him is underground." Like many young people, I lived in the present with my eye on the future. History to me was last week's footy results. During my last years as a school teacher, my subject was media studies. Much later, I woke up to the fact that the O'Connor story, as an example of a man destroyed by media, would have been a perfect scenario to share and analyse with my students. But I followed Sir Thomas religiously. Never involve your ancestors. 27 years ago, I joined the Maritime Museum here as head of education. Working here, I was constantly reminded of my great-grandfather. I realised as I stood with a mob of school kids at his statue outside the Fremantle Ports building, or at the beach where he died, I had something more to offer with my personal connection. So I began to look more deeply into my great-grandfather's story. In 2018, I met some Irish people with Joy, my wife, in Fremantle, and they invited us to give a talk at the Navan Historical Society in County Meath, near where O'Connor was born. Joy is a former head of education at the National Trust and co-author of the pipeline CY O'Connor built, available in the foyer. Thought it was a good idea. Travel halfway around the world for a 1-hour talk. What's not to like? So off we went. A couple of weeks after the talk, I drove off in search of the small village of Castleton, where O'Connor was born. I had the name of the property, Gravelmount, but no address. I was lucky as I rolled into the main street of Graveltown. There on the wall was the town's heritage trail, but of O'Connor, not a skerrick. Just a list of dastardly deeds by Cromwell and his crony mates. So where in a small Irish village do you go for information? My new best friend. The local publican came up with the goods. He knew a bit about the O'Connor story, from one of our WA mob who had dropped in some years back and left him a gift. He jumped up on the shelf, rattled some cans of Guinness, and the big reveal was something we all recognise, a profile of the pipeline. Thank you, cousin, wherever you are. My new best friend then proceeded to give me the directions to Gravelmount House, where O'Connor was born. Outside, turn left, head down the road until you see a red tractor, turn right, into the next drive, and there you are. The splendid plaque on the gate was presented in a ceremony in 2007, organised by the Seaway O'Connor Commemorative Committee. The plaque was unveiled by Mrs. Anne Plunkett, the Australian Ambassador for Ireland. There are a few other Aussies there that day, including our dear cousin, De Villiers. Thank you, De Villiers, who talked about her great-grandfather at the time. Now, O'Connor was born here in 1843. His parents were John and Elizabeth Yelverton O'Connor. Charles was the third child, 2 brothers before, 2 sisters afterwards. A very comfortable life on that green and pleasant land stretched before him. But 2 years later, the dark cloud of the Great Hunger spread over Southern Ireland. In the summer of 1845, potato crops began to fail. By the following year, the potato blight had spread throughout much of Southern Ireland, leading to a total disaster. The famine lasted for 6 years, and during that time of extreme hunger and hardship, the threat of eviction terrorised people who lived off the land. Most of those evicted from their homes emigrated, died, or ended up in the local workhouse. The O'Connor property was not immune. It was mostly subdivided into small holdings, and John O'Connor was virtually bankrupt as he tried to save his tenants. He froze their rents and spent the family's dwindling resources on welfare work. By 1849, the family, like his tenants, were forced to leave Gravelmount. But he was lucky. He was able to find work as secretary of a new railway in Waterford. The family was split up. Charles, aged 6, and sister Frances went to live with their uncle and aunt at Summerseat in Westmeath. While this must have been unsettling for 2 young children to be separated from their parents, the move to Summerseat gave Charles his first grade road to Damascus moment. His uncle was master of the local hunt, and Charles developed his great love of horses and riding during that time, a passion he carried to the last moments of his life. During his early years, Charles would have seen desperate figures like this shuffling along the roadside. He would have also been aware of the concern of his parents in their struggle to protect their farm and their tenants. His empathy towards workers in New Zealand and WA would have certainly stemmed from these early experiences. His introduction of the 8-hour day to his workers in West Australia and his willingness to help new arrivals turning up in Fremantle, particularly from Ireland and New Zealand looking for work, is a testament to this. In 1854, Charles was reunited with his family in Waterford and became fascinated with the world of steam. This was another epiphany that would last a lifetime. So Charles, at the impressionable age of 11, added the iron horse to his other list of passions, the hot-blooded horse. His father could afford a reasonable education for his young son at the Waterford Academy. However, he couldn't afford to follow the family tradition and send their sons to Dublin University. Instead, Charles had another lucky break. He got his hands dirty. At the age of 16, he was accepted as an apprentice to John Challoner Smith, who later became known as the father of Irish railways. Over the next 6 years, O'Connor established an excellent reputation in railway engineering. I can imagine his report card could have gone something like this. Survey skills, quick and accurate. Economics, excellent, could understand and manage money. Work ethic, very practical, loves being on site and getting involved in all aspects of the job. Organisational skills, has a knack for managing men, many of them much older than him. Responsibility, welcomes it. He welcomes it. He was definitely leadership material. When the engineer in charge of one construction project fell ill, O'Connor the apprentice stepped in and completed the job. These are all pointers to his future success. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and young engineers from Britain were in great demand around the empire. Charles was determined to be part of the story. No doubt he would have sat with his mentor John Challoner Smith and discussed the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London, when Britain was on top of the industrial world. They would have also discussed great engineers like Brunel and Stephenson. Charles was beginning to collect his heroes. This is Charles at 22 years old, just about to head off to New Zealand. In 1864, he left Ireland for New Zealand. He carried with him the substantial gift of a sextant from his old boss, John Challoner Smith. And on the voyage, with the help of the skipper, he taught himself to navigate. Within a week of arriving, he had a job working with a surveyor for £1 a day in the North Island where Hamilton now stands. He noted in a letter to a fellow apprentice in Ireland that he recognised the land he worked on as being confiscated from the natives. As a young man, knee-deep in water, holding a surveyor's pole, he would have had the luxury of time to think about such things. In September 1865, gold was discovered in Hokitika on the west coast of the South Island. A road was needed across the Alps, and O'Connor moved south to commence surveying and begin adding bridges and road construction to his skill set. By 1866, he was assistant engineer for the Westland District, and by 1872, aged 29, he was sent to Greymouth to repair the harbour, rail and roads after major flooding. The work was finished on time and on budget, and he was promoted to an executive position in Christchurch. His work on the Greymouth Harbour at the mouth of the Grey River later became a model for his harbour here at the mouth of the Swan River. A key friendship during this time on the West Coast was with his boss, Malcolm Fraser, not to be confused with the ex-Australian Prime Minister of the same name who famously lost his trousers in a Memphis hotel in 1986. O'Connor's lifelong friendship with Fraser, who emigrated to West Australia in 1870 to replace John Septimus Roe as Surveyor General, was to become a vital part of his move there 20 years later. Back in Christchurch, he met Susan Ness, and on the 5th of March, 1874, they married. Their first child, Aileen, was born the day before, on May the 4th. An unusual but not totally uncommon start to married life. Meanwhile, his career continued to blossom, and he moved back to the West Coast as District Engineer of the Westland. From here, O'Connor was promoted to Wellington, but his career stalled. He was passed over for the top job as an Engineer-in-Chief, and his life appeared to be drifting towards retirement. Enter John Forrest. He was 3 months into his job as Premier of West Australia and looking for an Engineer-in-Chief. At a conference in Sydney in April 1891, he met two delegates from New Zealand, who recommended O'Connor, a suggestion enthusiastically supported by the now Sir Malcolm Fraser. Had his pants back. O'Connor's old boss, who accompanied Forrest to the conference, Fraser immediately sent job details to O'Connor, telling him he must apply. The process was lightning fast compared with such an appointment today, and less than 3 weeks later, O'Connor received Forrest's now famous 3-word telegram, railways, harbours, everything, that helped to clinch the deal. I wonder if his old boss, Sir Malcolm, advised Forrest to put railways first on the list, knowing O'Connor's first love as a young engineer was the Irish railways. By May the 9th, he was on a ship bound for WA with his eldest daughter, Aileen, son Frank, and my grandmother, Bridget. But before they left, the family gathered in a photographic studio for the one and only family portrait we've ever found. And there it is. From the left, from your left, we've got Roderick, aged 10, Eva, later Lady Julius, aged 13, Susan, the magic age of 42, George Francis, or Frank, was 16, Myrta is 2, Aileen, who became Mrs. Simpson, 17, Charles, 49, Kathleen, 14, and there's Bridget in a lovely white dress, she's 7. On a wet and cold evening, the last day of May in 1891, the first contingent of the O'Connor family sailed into Albany Harbour. As CY looked up at the scattering of houses on the hill above the little harbour, little did he know that a one-legged Crimean War veteran, a Mr. Henry Passmore, could have been watching the ship come in. A few years later, he was to play an important role in convincing Forrest that O'Connor's plan for a harbour in the river mouth was a practical idea. More of Mr. Passmore a bit later on. I like to imagine my 7-year-old grandmother, having received permission, of course, from her older sister Eileen to wear her white party dress from the Wellington photograph, skipping down the gangplank to begin her lifelong connection with Albany. The next day, June the 1st, the family took the train north, arriving on the Foundation Day holiday. Part of the celebrations was horse racing at Woodman's Point, close to where O'Connor's world would end 11 years later. The following day, O'Connor met Forrest and received instructions for his first job. I need an all-weather harbour in the middle of the Swan River colony. I want the mail to arrive here, not Albany. Today's terms, he wanted the main postcode to be 6000 Perth, not 6330 Albany. O'Connor got the message. There'd already been much debate about the location of the harbour, and O'Connor was immediately furnished with a large bundle of plans, including one by the famous English harbour designer Sir John Coode, and one by a convict, an engineer, artist, architect, and a forger, Thomas Seyton Brown. Governor Robertson thought his plan was pretty neat, actually. While Perth and Fremantle were the centre of the colony, Albany's natural land-backed harbour was much safer and preferred by the P&O mail ships. In fact, P&O captains threatened to resign if they were ordered to visit Fremantle instead. Such was the poor reputation of Fremantle as a safe port. At public meetings about the site of the main harbour for the colony, an Albany supporter leapt to his feet and exclaimed, "I vote for Fremantle, protected as it is by the east coast of Africa." O'Connor explored the current situation and soon understood why Fremantle was such an unpopular and expensive port. The shallow approaches and typical onshore winds meant large ships had to anchor and gauge roads between Rottnest Island and the mainland, and passengers and cargo had to be ferried ashore. Building had commenced on the long jetty in the early 1870s, and it was extended 3 times to reach a length of 1 kilometre by the time O'Connor arrived. It still provided no protection from westerly and northwesterly gales. This letter from an American captain of the ship Saranac sums up the dilemma facing O'Connor. "Gentlemen, I have been in a good many places in my time, but this is the worst damn hole I ever saw. I was never so sick of a place in my life. May the curse of Christ rest on Fremantle and every son of a bitch in it, goddamn them all. I remain, gentlemen, your obedient servant, Captain D.B. Shaw." O'Connor quickly sorted through the bundle of plans, and without seeming to be overconfident or rude or unethical, he contradicted the highly respected professional Sir John Coode, who predicted sanddrift would make the harbour in the river impossible. "You'll be a dredging company, not a harbour company." Mumblings soon started around town of this simple shire engineer challenging a famous harbour builder, and a sir at that. But despite some resistance, his initial reactions with politicians, townfolk, and the workers impressed Forrest. These early days introduced West Australians to his skills as an economist, an engineer, a diplomat, a manager of men, and these skills he carried through all his projects for the rest of his time. Despite being a highly accomplished professional at the top of his game, he was always keen to seek out the holders of local knowledge, regardless of their status. In the case of harbour works, it was sailors, fishermen, sea captain, and those who understood coastal conditions. And this is where Mr. Passmore re-enters the story. He was fresh from stabilising Sandrift in the Princess Royal Harbour in Albany and had moved to North Fremantle. He takes O'Connor out in a small boat out here. Calm day, clear water, no sand, rocky bottom, seaweed, fish, no sign of Sandrift. "Where were you when Coode visited?" asked O'Connor. "Oh, I was in Albany," came the reply. Next day, Passmore takes Sir John Forrest out to have a look, and he too came on board, so to speak. So, backed by local knowledge, O'Connor argued the Sandrift was not a major problem, and after a royal commission, his harbour works were allowed to proceed, and they began with a ceremonial tipping of the first stones in the sea at Rouse Head in November 1892. Our grandmother Bridget used to refer to her father as an economist first and then an engineer, always aware of costs and potential savings. As an 8-year-old, Bridget would often accompany her father out to the North Mole on her pony Betty to watch the construction. He would have to explain to her how the use of local rocks and limestone dredged up and reused was a much cheaper solution than expensive concrete blocks Sir John Coode had advised. And as a postscript, the only time North Mole has received damage was in Cyclone Alby in 1878. Once the North Mole had extended far enough to protect the river mouth, and thanks to Alfred Nobel's invention of dynamite and gelignite, the blasting process could begin to remove the rock bar. This is an example of the beautiful Swedish pine boxes that brought the explosives to Fremantle and later to Mundaring Weir. The discarded boxes were immediately set upon by the workers and townfolk who made them into furniture. So centuries before IKEA, Fremantle had their own supply of flat-back furniture. O'Connor, the economist and recycler, would have been impressed. Now, if anyone's got one in their attic, I would love one. In Kalgoorlie or here. Now, blasting the bar. This is what happened out here. Jarrah trestles were positioned on the rocks, holes drilled down, waterproof pipes inserted, charges, explosive, fire in the hole, bang. And if you look carefully, you can see a rock flying just above the head of the guy in that boat. This, by the way, this picture is in the exhibition, and there's a wonderful description of the harbour being blown up, the bar, and there's a panorama which shows all the dredges and the Jarrah trestles and so on. Well worth a look. Some of these wonderful panoramas from 100 years ago. One day, a group of townspeople came knocking on O'Connor's door in Beach Street to complain the explosions were shaking ornaments off their mantelpieces. He immediately agreed to make the charges smaller and save their precious artefacts. O'Connor was very aware of the need to keep the locals on side. In recent years, I've wondered, what would he have done if a group of Aboriginal people came with a similar complaint? The explosions were destroying their walking track across the bar, upsetting their fishing practices, and alarming their spiritual Wargal, the creator and protector of waterways. I'm sure he would have listened, having grown up in Ireland at a time when the Great Hunger was ripping the country apart, when his family were forced to leave their farm and seek a new life. But Aboriginal people never came to his door. And what could he have done? By that time, the march of progress was unstoppable. On the 4th of May, 1897, commonly known as Star Wars Day, may the 4th be with you all, Mrs. Forrest brought the SS Sultan in through the heads to officially open the harbour with a beautiful piece of parallel parking right outside this door. Her husband, the Premier, was by her side, but where was O'Connor? His public works launch, you can see it up there with a flag at the back, signet, was there, but he was not on board. By that time, O'Connor had already been tapped on the shoulder by Forrest to design a water scheme for the Goldfields and had gone to the UK to have his pipeline scheme peer-reviewed. He was also going to receive the Companion of Honour of St Michael and St George, the CMG, in recognition of his work in the Swan River Colony and in particular the Fremantle Harbour. And there he is. Thanks today to Jackie Sprogo and sisters, we have this investiture suit here on display. Now, Jackie told me this wonderful story. They lent the suit some time back for public display. The staff then found a used handkerchief in a hidden pocket in the coat tail. They took the item out. They washed it. They ironed it and put it back, along with the opportunity to use O'Connor's DNA to clone another brilliant engineer and public servant. What a loss! O'Connor had left Fremantle for the UK in January 1897 and was joined by Forrest, who delayed his trip for the opening of the harbour. They went to raise money for the Coolgardie water scheme and to meet P&O shipping company officials to encourage them to bring their mail ships into Fremantle rather than Albany. Both these projects were successful, and the panel of British engineers reviewing the pipeline project concluded, there is no reason to suppose otherwise than it will prove to be entirely satisfactory. So a few months after SS Sultan arrived, Forrest and O'Connor were back in town and the project pipeline was all systems go. A team of hydraulics engineers, led by Thomas Hodgson, ranged over the hills looking for an appropriate site for a weir. They selected one at Mundaring on the Helena River, and here work began in 1898. Two major setbacks occurred within a few months of each other. The first was a fault line or fissure in the rock foundation of the weir. It required a further 12 months of excavation before stable bedrock was reached and the concrete pour could begin. O'Connor met this challenge with an elegant solution, the introduction of electric lighting and double shifts. He was always ready to embrace new technology. My sister Mary, who's somewhere here, found an interesting artefact in the bottom of our grandmother's old china cabinet. It's a small core sample of a rock labelled Mundaring Weir. The other words are indecipherable. I fantasise, with no proof mind you, sitting down at the family table at tea, he presented one to each of his children as a memento of finally reaching rock bottom in the battle to save the Mundaring Weir site. He always encouraged his children to share their news around the dinner table, and this could have been him returning the favour. Another major setback was a tragic wreck of the Carlisle Castle in a force 10 gale southwest of Garden Island in 1899. The ship was carrying locking bars manufactured in England, an essential part of the new rivetless pipe technology. You can see the locking bars running longitudinally along the pipe. O'Connor adjusted the budget and got on with a new order immediately. These mishaps certainly slowed progress and were gleefully reported by the Sunday Times as an indication that the first half pint of tarry fluid will reach the Goldfields somewhere about the year 2000. Just had my first half pint. O'Connor was always on the lookout for new ideas and cutting-edge technology. The use of rivetless pipes, locking bars, and mechanical corking machines, you can see one on the top of the pipes there, are great examples of the way he approached the challenge of building the longest pipeline in the world. These pipes would lead to less leakage and less friction. Because this is also the world's largest pipe manufacturing process, O'Connor wisely chose two contractors, Ferguson and Hoskins, each manufacturing 30,000 pipes. Hoskins was the inventor of the locking bar technique, where two semicircles of steel pipes were joined by long locking bars to form a pipe. O'Connor persuaded him to allow Ferguson to use his patent system, royalty-free. The first pipe rolled off the production line on the 26th of August 1899, and each factory one followed every 6 minutes. And I read that and I double-checked it, and it was Karen Jackson I used to work with here, it must be right. But if you multiply a pipe every 6 minutes, in 75 weeks, at 8 hours a day for a 5-day week, you'd have 60,000 pipes. Now, for a small community, the most isolated city in the empire, to produce something like that is just, I think, absolutely amazing. As 1901 rolled around, along came Federation. This added to O'Connor's woes. With the birth of a nation came the early signs of the impending death of an engineer. With Forrest at the helm, O'Connor had some separation from criticism. With Federation, Forrest moved to Melbourne as a Minister for Defence, and O'Connor's political flak jacket was gone, exposing him to mounting criticism. In the year after Forrest left, as Kim Beazley remarked in the 2017 O'Connor lecture, there were 4 changes of leadership and a time of deep political immaturity. O'Connor never doubted his water pipeline scheme. He found it hard when people said, OK, I understand the concept of a single pipeline, but couldn't see that multiplying that by 8 could lead to anything else but a scheme of madness. And why had a pipeline of this length never been done before? Well, he might have replied, it's never been required. The weight of personal criticism and the impending Royal Commission reached a point in March 1902, and it was all too much. His professional life and social life was unravelling. His doctor was away, his best friend was on stress relief, and his solicitor said, just ignore the criticism, which wasn't helpful at the time in the circumstances. At home, he was the father figure, the strong, silent Victorian male. He must have felt there was nowhere to turn to. Monday morning, the 10th of March, 1902. From the evidence we have, this seems to be the order of events. It had been a very hot weekend. O'Connor rises early for his morning ride and knocks on Bridget's door. She's his usual riding companion. I'm not feeling well, comes the answer. See you at breakfast. A reply she will live to regret for the rest of her life. At this point, he realises he'll be riding alone. He sees a way out. In the yard, he greets his groom, Arthur Lynch, who stands with Moonlight saddled and ready to go. O'Connor excuses himself and goes back inside. On his desk, a letter of resignation he has struggled over for a couple of days sits there. He adds a date and a comment at the bottom, 10/3/02. Put the wing walls on the Helena Weir at once. His final words were for his water scheme, not for the grieving family who would find this note. On his way out, he silently enters his son Roderick's room and takes a revolver from the desk beside his bed. He takes the reins of Moonlight from Arthur Lynch and swings into Beach Street for the last time. In the aftermath of his death, all criticism drives up, like a tap turning off. It was found that he owned no property, destroying the myth that he had used taxpayers' money to line his pockets. He died a relatively poor man with assets of less than £200 and a modest life insurance policy. Soon after his death, the member for Claremont, J.C. Foulkes, saw Susan O'Connor on a train in a second-class carriage and felt ashamed that the widow of the man who managed and reformed the railways did not have a free pass. Foulkes went straight to Parliament and strongly supported a bill to give O'Connor's widow a lifetime annuity of £250. There was not a whisper of dissent in the House. The family moved out of Fremantle and moved to West Perth. Over the years, articles connected to O'Connor have turned up at our house. One of the items I handed over to Batty Library is an accounts book carefully detailing their spending in the early days of the move, reflecting the challenge to keep costs under the monthly budget in line with the annual annuity of £250. Now this is another example of what you find at the bottom of a cupboard. Like Mary found a little core of granite This was a souvenir booklet printed after the opening of the pipeline in January 1903. It was found at the bottom of a cupboard by an English cousin who was cleaning out a London house owned by her aunt Pat Nuttall, a granddaughter of O'Connor. The invitation is addressed to Mr. and Mrs. C.Y. Simpson, that's O'Connor's eldest daughter Aileen, and her husband Charles. The Simpsons had moved to UK after their marriage in Fremantle. One of my favourite quotes, thanks to Diana Freilink, from that great day in Kalgoorlie is an official vigorously toasting the event with a glass of champagne, remarking, "Never has there been so much talk about water and so little drunk." O'Connor's public papers, challenging and perceptive, tell us a great deal. So what about the survival of any family private papers? Not much. My aunt spoke of stories of a big bonfire of personal letters sometime after his death, and I suppose this was not uncommon in those days to destroy personal information after a death, especially one that had brought devastation and shame to the family. Maybe there's still time for a bottom-of-a-cupboard discovery of a bundle of letters somewhere in Ireland or New Zealand. But there are two valuable accounts of their father, one by Bridget and one by Kate, written in their own hand. Bridget, in later life, a long-time leader of the Girl Guides in West Australia, keeps her account to the facts of the man and his good works. Not so much about the father they obviously loved and admired. It's titled For the Young Historians at PLC School and includes some wonderful stories of his early days on the west coast of New Zealand, where they measure rain in feet, not inches. They have the feeling of stories told when the two were out on horseback inspecting the Fremantle Harbour Works, and CY, relaxed and chatty in the saddle, was recalling his young days. One of my favourite stories, Bridget tells, is describing how the men carried boulders on their shoulders while crossing fast-flowing creeks, the extra weight helping to keep a foothold. Here, O'Connor was in his element at the pointy end of engineering. My grandfather suffered greatly from family tragedies. After her father died, she lost her brother Roderick in World War I and two sons in World War II. Us kids spent many hours at her Mount Street home, and not once was there talk about their deaths and how it affected their family. For Gran, the keep calm and carry on safety poster from World War II Britain was her attitude to life. It's not that opportunities didn't arise. I remember driving my grandmother to Albany in the mid-1960s in her grey hydromatic Holden 2J200. What a perfect opportunity, cocooned in the front seat of a car on long stretches of Albany Highway, concentrating on the road ahead with every opportunity to ask a question without eye contact. But I'd not long had my licence and I'd suddenly grown up, or so I thought, and life was not to be found in the rear vision mirror. Now we come to Kate. This brilliant photograph by Richard Waldendorp, taken when she was in her early 90s, not long before her death. Kate O'Connor was the artist and free spirit of the family and the rebel gene keeper. Her account is much more revealing, referring to her family as harum-scarums. She writes about the open house they kept with meals for everybody, spare beds and handouts for those in need, particularly the working men down on their luck. Once again, this is the empathy gene of O'Connor's father kicking in. What also comes out is a man totally absorbed in his work. Kate suggested he hardly seemed to realise he'd changed countries, but she also saw a lonely man without his old friends from New Zealand and a person that hardly accepted invitations, preferring to entertain at home. As a public figure, he was acutely aware of being compromised by a risky personal association. Or so he thought until the Sunday Times came knocking. What also came out from these accounts is a comfortable and happy family life in Fremantle, although Kate, 14 years old on arrival in Fremantle, missed the green and pleasant land of New Zealand, and like her siblings, she never really took to the new country. Both girls remember a man totally absorbed in his work, but having an inquiring mind and loved solving problems and loved being presented with a smart idea, however simple. Kate's accounts also challenged some of the family stories, particularly his extravagance with hats and his penchant for dashing them on the ground and dancing on them when he was annoyed. Kate recalls this as an old story from New Zealand and had never actually seen him doing it herself. Considering his large head and the fact he would have ordered his hats from England and that his occupation was an economist, acutely aware of budgets and time frames for delivering materials, it seems this family story is not to be trusted. Another story I don't think can be completely trusted is that after he died, the Sunday Times never darkened the door of the family house again, following the scurrilous treatment CY received. At home, I have a scrapbook of Kate's from later life, which includes Sunday Times articles, some annotated in her own hand. Maybe for her there was a cooling off period. O'Connor had a great sense of humour and took much delight in repeating the time Lady Forrest met 3 of his children for the first time. "Your wife must be very good looking, Mr. O'Connor," she remarked. This also gives us a wonderful clue to the strong bond that developed between the Forrest and the O'Connor families. And it was that bond, that the 2 men and the families together, that produced this wonderful decade for West Australia. Our grandmother followed this tradition when we visited, with lashings of Fanta and barley sugar. And on one occasion, she gave me a medal. One of her relatives had won at an event in Ireland after I'd done well in an athletics carnival. I've never found out. I tried to trace him back. It wasn't the egg and spoon race, it was something a bit bigger, so I'm pretty pleased about that. One thing we know for sure is that CY was particularly keen to encourage his children in all sorts of activities. Being beside the river, they became interested in water sports, and CY joined the Fremantle Rowing Club as vice president to support them. I found an old Fremantle rowing program of the time when all the O'Connor girls listed together in a rowing event. They were all in a 4 together. Unfortunately, no result was given, and they were all listed as Miss O'Connor. Miss O'Connor, Miss O'Connor, Miss O'Connor, Miss O'Connor. My guess is Kate was a stroke. So how do we remember O'Connor in West Australia? There's a suburb of O'Connor, there's streets, there's waterways, a beach, lectures, 2 football teams inspired by his harbour, Fremantle Dockers men and women's team, and of course the statues. This is an early example of crowdfunding. Half the money from the public subscription, the other half from the grateful government. It was unveiled by Sir John Forrest in June 1911. The writer Xavier Herbert said it all. A tragic statue recognition, too bloody late. In 1999, this sculpture by a local artist, Tony Jones, was unveiled just off the beach where C.O. O'Connor died. It's a powerful statement, with the rider taut and twisted, looking back at Fremantle Harbour. You get up close, you can see the horse's nostrils are flared, the ears pricked, something very serious is going on. In a stiff sea breeze, it charges through the waves, and on a quiet day it glows in reflected sunset. In 2007, it was widely acclaimed as Perth's best bit of public art. It's also a convenient clothes horse when his Fremantle Harbour Dockers need a lift, and I believe that he should be the number 1 ticket holder for the Dockers. O'Connor would have been delighted to learn of the introduction of the women's Dockers team to the AFLW. He lived at County Meath, was one of the great centres of Gaelic football. He would have known about it. And if he'd learned about the AFL and his daughters, because he was always pushing his girls into outdoor activities, he would see this team, and I can see he'd say, Bridget, she's the calm and collected rebounding half-back. And Kate, the tenacious contested ball player. This is the Epic Museum in Dublin. In 2018, Joy and I went to this place. It celebrates the lives and achievements of Irish people who've made a name for themselves overseas. Surely we thought a perfect canvas for the O'Connor pipeline story, particularly after seeing how the community around Castleton had embraced his story and organised the plaque on the gate at Gravelment. So we went searching. Not a crumb, not a scary. There was a great piece on John Boyle O'Reilly of Fenian and Catawba escape fame. In fact, O'Connor and O'Reilly, both Meath men, born within a few years of each other and a few miles apart, both made a name for themselves in West Australia. O'Connor on a government contract and Riley at the government's pleasure on the last convict ship to Australia. His escape to America and the fight for the free island cause is a dramatic story of daring do, certainly worth telling, as I believe is the O'Connor story. Incidentally, on Sunday, October 16, in this very theatre, there will be a fascinating lecture delivered by Dr. Kate Gregory on John Boyle O'Reilly's Book of Poetry, which is held at the State Library. Tickets available on Eventbrite. End of commercial. We went searching for other Australian-Irish connections. My 10-year-old sports-mad self approved the Jim Stein story, the Irish Gaelic footballer who played for Melbourne and won a Brownlow medal for the best AFL player in 1991. Then we found an engineer, Peter Rice from County Louth. His first job was the design and construction of the roof of the Sydney Opera House. His nickname was the James Joyce of structural engineering. Surely the longest pipe in the world could equal that. We left a bit disappointed, but filled in a suggestions card, put forward O'Connor for a future story. 6 weeks ago, nearly 4 years later, I wrote to the museum and to their great credit received a reply the next day saying they have received our note and his story may be added at a future date. That conversation will continue. Now, yesterday, this is helping to get him into the Epic Museum. I received an email via the Fremantle Library from a Noel Murphy in Ireland. He makes radio documentaries and is planning to visit Fremantle and include the O'Connor story in a program entitled The Hands That Built Australia. He couldn't recall where he'd heard about O'Connor. It wasn't from the Epic Museum. Not yet. Just outside the door, jutting out from under the museum foundations, is a remnant of the Limestone Bar that was mentioned earlier by Robin. O'Connor removed it to open the river for the inner harbour. Some years back, Noongar elder Trevor Wally told me the story of the Rock Bar and the battle between the Waggle, creator of the protective waterways, and Yondok, the huge saltwater crocodile splashing saltwater into the river. Waggle won the battle and tossed the body of the crocodile out to sea where it formed Meandip. We know it as Garden Island. The tail of the crocodile was placed across the river mouth to protect the freshwater river. If you look out at Meandip on a sunny day, you can see a white scar at the northern end of the island where the Waggle picked off the crocodile's tail. While the industrial might of colonial Europe charged ahead with projects that brought economic and social benefits to West Australia, they also directly confronted Aboriginal land and stories. Here, the removal of the bar destroyed an ancient river crossing and fishing grounds, while Mundaring Weir cut off the flow of the Helena River and the pipeline crossed Waggle tracks on its way to Kalgoorlie. 20 years ago, I was walking with the inspirational Aboriginal elder Dr. Noel Nannett. We were planning an Aboriginal European walk around Fremantle. He told me that for these actions, O'Connor was sung to death. Now is a good time to add the Whadjuk Noongar response to the story of the removal of the Rock Bar. Melding these stories together can be a powerful force towards reconciliation. Now, as Pat mentioned, recently the Water Corporation have reached a view that the pipeline needs to be replaced to ensure the safe delivery of water. Under the proposed plans, over the next 50 years the pipeline will be dismantled and an underground replacement will be constructed. O'Connor, I'm sure, would approve. He's a practical man, and if told his pipeline had reached a point of being unsafe, he'd say, well, let's fix it. With a new pipeline going underground, maybe it's time to consider new ways we can reinterpret this enduring project with European and First Nation stories sharing the spotlight. perhaps using cutting-edge technology such as drones. But that's a discussion for another day. So finally, we're back at WA O'Connor Beach, where Tony Jones has created a sacred site for all of us. This beach is heritage listed and has strong connections with horses. The first WA horse race was held here. Melbourne Cup's horses trained here, as did the 10th Light Horse during World War II. Today you can see the horses exercising along the beach in the early morning. It was a favourite run for CY and Moonlight, and it's the place where he chose to end his life. Each year on March the 10th, family and friends gather here at 7 a.m. to catch up, chat, swim with the horses, reflect on life, death and the gap in between. We offer a thought to CY and his remarkable achievements. We scatter flowers and go to coffee together. No speeches are needed, no formalities. We behave as we expect he would like us to. O'Connor's great-grandchildren are now the seniors here, but the great-grandkids are joining us now, and so are their children. They will carry on this tradition and his legacy will live on. Thank you.